I'm not scared. I'm just cautious, not about myself, but especially about my colleagues. So we, invented the processes how to limit the risks. There is no way how to make the risk zero, but you can limit it. And I think everyone knows that since the murder of Ján Kuciak, that there is this risk.
Corruption, persecution, and even murder. In this summer series, we dive into some jaw-dropping investigations done by journalists across Europe. What do their stories reveal about the state of European democracy? And what mark did they leave behind on society and the journalists themselves? This is a podcast by the investigative newsroom Follow the Money. I'm your host, Emma de Chatinier, and I'm joined by Lise Witteman, founder of Follow the Money's Brussels desk and my co-host for the summer. In this first episode, we go to Slovakia. Journalist Ján Kuciak was investigating high-level political corruption, including connections to the country's Prime Minister Robert Fico. Kuciak never got to finish that story. In 2018, Kuciak and his fiancée were murdered at just 27 years old. After the murder, journalists across Slovakia picked up where Kuciak had been forced to stop and help bring down Fico's government. In the studio with us today is journalist Lukáš Diko. And Lukáš will talk about the impact that the murder had on Slovakia and how journalists continued the trail that Kuciak left behind.
Welcome, Lukáš. Thank you so much for joining us for this very first episode of the summer series. Before we dive into your investigation, could you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Hi, thank you very much for having me here. I am editor-in-chief of Investigative Center of Ján Kuciak in Bratislava, Slovakia. And we are the center which was founded after the murder of our colleague investigative journalist Ján Kuciak in 2018. And maybe just shortly about me, I am in journalism for more than 25 years and especially concentrating on investigative stories.
And the specific story that we'll be discussing today starts actually with the work done by another journalist that you just mentioned, a journalist that was murdered in relation to the work that he was doing. Could you take us back to the final investigation that Ján Kuciak was working on? What was he looking into?
Shortly before the murder, a few months before Ján Kuciak was murdered, he started to investigate a group of Italian people who lived in eastern Slovakia with ties to Italian mafia group Ndrangheta. He found out that some of them had political contacts close to government party's mayor of Prime Minister Robert Fico.
And in relation to that work, Kuciak was killed in 2018. The court case is still ongoing, but it was allegedly a Slovak businessman that Kuciak had also been investigating that ordered the murder. But can you take us back to that day of the murder? What was that day like for you?
Ján Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kušnírova, they were killed on the 21st of February 2018. The news about the murder emerged a few days after that. I think it was on 26th of February. I was sitting in a cafe when the news about two dead people in a small village close to Bratislava emerged, and when I realized that it was journalist Ján Kuciak, I was really sad because I was in journalism for 20 years at the time, and we never could have imagined that one of us could have been killed because of journalistic work.
In a sense, you woke up to a new country, a new view on your own country.
Yeah, to a completely different reality, because the day of the murder of Ján and Martina has changed the Slovakia and especially the media.
And so that was the perception for you as a journalist, but how was the murder received in Slovakia in general?
It was such a horrible crime that a large movement, non-political movement, started. A lot of protests for decent Slovakia started in all cities around the country. At the time, it was the biggest protest since the Velvet Revolution in 1989, when the communism had fallen in Czechoslovakia. And tens of thousands of people protested against the government just because of the murder of Ján Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova, because it was shock for a whole society. And I think a lot of people could relate themselves to young people who planned their wedding and were killed just because of investigative work of Ján. It was really, really horrible.
Yeah, because I believe that when they were found, that his fiancée had still her laptop open with looking for wedding dresses. It was just a new house. They were really starting their lives.
Yeah, they were planning their lives, and it was suddenly ended by a murder. Even the people from the government were shocked. But shortly after, they started to do weird things. For example, Prime Minister Robert Fico and at the time Minister of Interior Robert Kaliňák, they organized a press conference. It was 2 days after the bodies were found, where they put 1 million euros on the table like in Western movies. It was like, if you are able to give us evidence about the murder of Ján Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova, we'll give you 1 million euro. And they also tried to verbally undermine the work of Ján Kuciak. But later on, Prime Minister had to step down, Minister of Interior had to step down, and also the police president stepped down. And before, the people with ties to Antonino Vadala, the Italian 'Ndrangheta alleged member, also had to leave the office of the government.
But why exactly was that? Because at that point, the investigation hadn't been completed, of course. So why was there already this link between this murder and the government? How did it lead to the government having to step down?
Because on the day when there was the press conference with the 1 million euros, all Slovak media and also media around Europe published the last story of Ján Kuciak, partly already written by Ján.
Right.
So they just needed to edit it and put some context into it. And so it was published on 28th of February, so 1 week after the murder. After this story, last story of Ján Kuciak was published by all Slovak media and also around Europe, the people from the government office with ties to Italian people in Eastern Slovakia stepped down. And after the large public protests, Minister of Interior and Prime Minister stepped down, and the government was refurbished.
So Kuciak's legacy caused this political earthquake, but it was also a big turning point for journalism in Slovakia, and it even led to the creation of the Investigative Center of Ján Kuciak, which you are now editor-in-chief of. How did that happen?
It started with the project Kočner's Library. It was the name of the project, and Pavla Holcová from Czech Investigative Center, which is based in Prague, received the whole investigation file of the murder of Ján Kuciak. There was a lot of information about other cases, not only about the murder, because
so this was the police file.
Yes, it was the police file.
So that was all the information that the police found at his place, but also all the other leads, the interviews they had already done.
Yes, everything what police collected in connection with the investigation of murder of Ján Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova, a source gave to Pavla Holcová.
And she was the Czech colleague.
She was the Czech colleague of Ján, and she decided that she will open this league for all Slovak media, and that was the start of Kočner's Library project, where all independent Slovak media were invited and cooperated together on analyzing the data and publishing the stories.
And you also needed like a special room that couldn't be bugged.
Yes.
What does this look like?
Yeah, it was. I didn't mention it was 53 terabytes of data. So OCCRP helped with analyzing and this creating the database of the data, and also with creating a special room, as you mentioned, where all the computers were connected only to this database and not to the outside world, so that anything isn't unable to be stolen from the database. And journalists who were part of this project, it was like more than 11 media involved before they competed, but in this project they all came together, met and were looking into the data and looking for the stories in this special locked room, which was disconnected from the world and the internet. And they analyzed the data, and they found a lot of stories about corruption, about people who were connected to the person who was the middle woman in ordering the murder, members of the parliament who were in touch with her. Then the big project the Kochner's library started, huge cooperation of all the media.
And can you tell us a bit more about what it was like to work in that setup with all those journalists coming together with that common goal? How should I imagine that?
Well, it didn't came natural, I think, to journalists who suddenly not compete anymore.
This is something, it was really very new feeling for me, because I was editor-in-chief before, and I used to work a lot with many journalists, that we were sitting like 15 of the best investigative journalists in Slovakia discussing the story together and also using 15 brains, and it was much faster. We always published the stories together.
Yeah.
And nobody competed. We were able to just push away our egos and start cooperate, because it was important. The Kochner's Library project still produced common stories for all these media until, I think, 2022. And for example, we also used it, or you still have been using it in confirming some data when we have other projects.
So where the library started off as a project, then it turned into this newsroom that still exists today. Yes.
Yeah, it's the Investigative Center of Ján Kuciak. And we know how to do that whenever it's needed. It's still ongoing in smaller scale, and we try as the center which preserves the legacy of Ján Kuciak to be the driving force behind this cooperation.
You just mentioned it was terabytes of data, and that led to a lot of stories that we will, of course, not all discuss here. But what for you were like the main stories that you really found in that huge amount of data?
I think the most shocking thing, not only for me, but also for other journalists, was that the businessman who allegedly ordered the murder of Ján Kuciak was able to collect so much information, even which was thought had been lost long time or destroyed. He had it.
So in that sense, were you able to finish the work that Kuciak himself couldn't finish?
I would not say we finished Jan's work, but we continued in it, because it put them under the spotlight. Before, nobody knew that there are some Italians with alleged ties to 'Ndrangheta in eastern Slovakia, but since then, everybody knows that these people were living there and have been still living in eastern Slovakia.
Yeah, and not just that those people were living there, but also that there were alleged connections between those groups and the heart of political power, including Prime Minister Robert Fico, who was forced to step down as a result of this in 2018. But he's now back in power as Prime Minister. How did that happen?
Yes, in 2018, Robert Fico was forced to step down as a Prime Minister. In 2020, there was still this anti-corruption atmosphere in the society, so the opposition won. But because of the pandemic, war in Ukraine, Robert Fico was able to regain the biggest group of voters. They used the pandemic, and they were supporting anti-vaccination demonstrations during pandemic, and also anti-systemic movements. And after the start of war in Ukraine, they were, let's say, on pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian side, and scared people because of the war. And these things connected helped them to regain the support of the voters in 2023 elections.
Yeah, he really surfed the waves of disinformation and used it to his advantage to really gain, I think, the more rural conservative votes. in Slovakia?
I think that he collected all these different groups under
Everyone
one
who's
umbrella.
anti-something.
Yeah, and what the effect of that was that the respect to the state institutions became very low in Slovakia.
Yeah,
because
there's
of
no
this.
trust anymore in...
Yes.
But things did initially change as a result of Kuciak's legacy, right? What's like left of those changes today still?
I think the anti-corruption atmosphere in the society was very, very, very strong after the murder, and it was because of the murder. And it also started a lot of investigations of oligarchs and politicians in 2020, especially those with close ties to Fico. And it was for the first time, I would say, in Slovak history, when such high-profile persons started to be investigated. So people started to learn how the big corruption system worked at the time. And many of oligarchs and politicians close to Fico were arrested, charged with crimes, and sent to trial. And another change was in journalism, that journalists after the murder got a lot of support from public, and there was the sentiment that everyone wanted to be an investigative journalist. What's worse, that 8 years after the murder, there is not that much of that sentiment left, and almost no one wants to be an investigative journalist, not even a journalist, because when we speak with the young people studying journalism, we know that they are still scared because of the murder of Ján Kuciak. And also, there is a lot of verbal attacks by politicians, and they just don't want to be attacked on a weekly basis by politicians in their work.
And in terms of like the political fight against corruption, is that something that still exists in the same way now as it did a couple of years ago?
No, it doesn't exist at all. The government, which was formed after the elections in 2020, it was formed by the opposition parties. So the only result of this government were these investigations. Otherwise, almost all the other parts of society were like mismanaged. And what has changed is that the first important thing that Fico, after his government was sworn in 2023, was they changed the criminal law in the way so that their close people who were on trial or charged are not prosecuted anymore. So the punishments for financial crimes were lowered to very low levels. So when you do tax evasion up until some, 20,000 euros, you just get the financial punishment. Statutes of limitations were lowered, so majority of crimes is not crime anymore because it's more than 10 years.
Yeah, it's outdated. Yeah.
Now they try to also to limit the power of cooperating witnesses, because major cases are based on cooperating witnesses. The people who once were part of the corruption circle and now decided to be witnesses. So majority of corruption is not investigated right now, and older cases will be...
And the public just accepts this?
Yes. Part of society, yes, because what has happened is that there were, after 2020, there were so many cases, people started to be tired of it.
Yeah.
It was too the corrupt, they were just...
Yeah,
they couldn't absorb.
And this is of course very recognizable in a general sense for investigative journalism, that people don't know what to do with all this bad news anymore. In a sense, how do you deal with that?
For us, it's a mission to, as some of these supporters told us, to be their eyes and ears in these bad things, so they don't do that. We do that for them. And for us, it's important because otherwise, I think without investigative journalism, Slovakia would be even in worse situation than it is. Because when Ján Kuciak was at his before the murder of Ján Kuciak, at the time many corruption cases were not investigated properly by law enforcement. So investigative journalists were the only ones who uncovered these things. And once it's published, it's, that's the public interest. And then if there will be someone at the police who wants to investigate, hopefully they will investigate. But at least we can uncover as investigative journalists by our journalistic means corruption or mismanagement of the state.
And so that the basic form of transparency and democracy is still kept alive, even though it's difficult times at the moment.
Yes, it's still kept alive. What is problematic is that powerful, they don't care. They do whatever without taking into consideration the law, the processes.
They feel like untouchable. It doesn't even matter.
But considering that your whole newsroom started in the wake of a murder, and what you also mentioned about young people being scared of becoming an investigative journalist, how do you yourself deal with that fear? Are you also scared in doing your work?
I'm not scared. I'm just cautious, not about myself, but especially about my colleagues. So we, invented the processes how to limit the risks. There is no way how to make the risk zero, but you can limit it. And I think everyone knows that since the murder of Ján Kuciak, that there is this risk. And we live with that, but despite that, we still try to work in public interest and to uncover things.
What gives you hope to keep going in your work?
It's always it's important to give this information to public, because we live in EU, and EU is not only about European funds, it's about common values. And I think it's important, even though it might be very vague, these European values, but it's the core, it's the heart of Europe and Slovakia, then that we need to preserve the values of freedom, free press,
rule of law,
anti-corruption, and this is what motivates me, I think, the most, to uncover things with aim to support the democratic values.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it for today's conversation. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, Lukáš.
Thank you for having me here.